Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. My name's Charles Gibson. I'm the Regional Campaign Coordinator for Best Britain for the North, which, if you're confused about the definition of the North, it starts at about Birmingham and runs all the way up to Scotland, so I do a lot of driving. But I'm particularly pleased to have crossed the border from Stockport over to Yorkshire today. We've got a great panel here for our very quick 45-minute session on detoxifying the immigration debate. We've got Natalie Bennett, who I'm sure needs no introduction as the former leader of the Green Party. We've got the fantastic Julie Ward, who was introduced recently at the last session, an MEP for the North West of England, one of my Labour MEPs. And the fabulous Emmy van Deurzen, which I'm sure I've pronounced incorrectly, and I apologise, who is a psychotherapist and chair of Voices for Europe, a fantastic campaign group working across Europe and the UK on this campaign. So, without further ado, we'll have 3 quick 5-minute speeches from all of our speakers, and then we'll open up the floor to questions and discussion on that. So I think we'll go in this order, and we'll start with Julie Ward.
I want to talk about identity, really. I want to talk about who we are. And you don't have to go very far back in your own history to realise that most of us came from somewhere else. My ancestors were Huguenot refugees. That is the first large wave of refugees that came to this country in the late, I think it was 1600s, and in fact gave the word refugee to our vocabulary. And so this was a group of people who were fleeing because of religious persecution. My family ended up living in Nottingham. Is there anybody here from Nottingham or knows Nottingham? There is a lace market in Nottingham, and the lace market in Nottingham dates from this time, because my ancestors were amongst the group of refugees who brought skills with them. They brought textile skills, they brought lace making skills with them. And what they did was to found the wealth of that city. So it is the basis upon which Nottingham was able to build its industry, build its USP, if you like. And I think that we need to talk about these stories about who we are, because migration it's a human activity. It has happened since time immemorial, and it will continue to happen. And we only have to put ourselves in the shoes of the people who are on the move to understand that we have to have a positive narrative about it, because there, but for the grace of God, go us. It could be us. Mm-hmm. Okay. I spend a lot of time defending and championing free movement. For me, it's really important that we have less borders, not more, that we rediscover our sense of welcome. Now, although the debate itself around the referendum got very toxic around immigration, many of the cities and the towns and the communities in my constituency, and in fact right across the UK, small places as well as large cities, and also Brexit voting places as well as pro-Remain places, have got incredible projects that have been set up to welcome refugees, and that includes cities of sanctuary, all kinds of interfaith projects, all kinds of people raising money and resources to either send to refugees or programs of welcome and introduction for refugees and migrants. And I think that tells you something hopeful about the British people, because fundamentally, at the bottom of all this awful stuff, there is a genuine compassion for people who find themselves in trouble. And if we can bring people together to be in the same space, to share food, I've got a thing going with cake here, haven't I? Okay. But if you bring people together just to have those honest people-to-people conversations, what you discover is that everybody really wants the same thing. Okay, we are not so different. I one of the jobs I had in the European Parliament in the Culture and Education Committee was to write a report that's called Intercultural Dialogue, Diversity and Education for Fundamental Values. They all have sexy titles like that. But it's significant because it was the Culture Committee's response to the Paris Declaration. The Paris Declaration was the 28 education ministers coming together in Paris after the Charlie Hebdo murders and after the Danish attacks to discuss the causes of, if you like, extremism, the causes of hate, the causes of division in our society, which, if pursued, can lead to a very extreme response. And I should also mention, while we're talking about this, extreme responses is also the response that the man who murdered Joe Cox made as well, that if you drip feed poison to people over a period of years, things happen inside people's heads. Mm-hmm. Anyway, my report was a parliamentary response to the Paris Declaration, because the knee-jerk response that states make to crises, bomb attacks, terrorist attacks, or threats, is actually more borders, more surveillance, more police. Yeah? It's not a human response, which is to say, shall we get to know these people? Shall we find out who they are? Shall we think about how we feel about that? Are there reasons why this might be happening? So it's a very important report because it sets out a policy framework with concrete actions, really just to do many of the things that I know are already happening in communities and at a grassroots level. What we really, really need to do is to have these kinds of programs. We need to have investment in these kinds of programs. We need to have children, the youngest children in our schools, and engaging with notions of what it means to be a citizen, with what the word refugee means, with what welcome means. We need to be doing these things both in formal education and informal education at all levels. So I feel that it's very important to continue to be positive and to speak in a positive way about migration, whether it's economic migration, whether it's migration and asylum because of war, because people's lives are unsafe. Now, I just want to talk finally just about there's been if the word refugee is kind of accepted, isn't it? But migrants not. But many people are fleeing because their lives are unsustainable. They're leaving homes. They're not staying in places where there's drought. They're not staying in places where there's no future for them. They're not staying in places, all the people who had to leave Greece, for example, because they just couldn't make a living there. So I think we have to actually talk about unsustainable lives. In terms of climate change, we've got climate refugees, but these people would not be considered to be refugees or asylum seekers. They would be considered to be economic migrants who should return home somehow. And do what? We have to accept some kind of responsibility for history and for our actions as an industrial country that contributed to unsustainable lives in less developed countries. So I think we have to have these wider conversations, interrogating these terms, but being very, very positive about what it means to be a migrant, what it means to be a refugee, and fundamentally how we are, I believe, still a welcoming, compassionate nation.
Thank you very much, Julie. And now on to Natalie.
Well, thank you very much, and it's great to see everyone here. I wasn't here this morning because I've come up from Sheffield where I was working on climate change, which feeds into a lot of the things that Julie was just talking about. And I'm not going to sort of cross over that same territory except to say that I pretty well agree with everything she just said. And also perhaps to share a little personal story, which is, for anyone who doesn't know, my accent comes from Australia originally. But if you go back 2 generations in my family, you'll find some economic migrants. Some of them were Lancashire locksmiths, and some of them were Cornish tin miners. And that story that all of us, many of us have in our backgrounds, all of us have somewhere or know someone who's got those kind of stories. Let's tell those personal stories of how it all fits together. But I think I wanted to start today with something I've actually been saying ever since 2012 when I was first elected as leader of the Greens. Because even back in then, when the referendum wasn't even, the 2016 referendum wasn't even really seriously on the agenda, I was saying about how we need to talk to people who, when you knocked on their doors and you asked them an open-ended question, what are you concerned about, when they said immigration. Because what I always did, and what I believe we always should do, is say, yes, but what does that mean to you? What aspects, what things, how does that affect your life? And what you will get back from most people is variations of three things, which is low wages, crowded schools and hospitals, my kids can't get a council house, housing is too expensive. And it's really important, whether you're on a street stall, whether you're engaging in social media, when people immediately come to you and say, I'm concerned about immigration, don't immediately assume they're racist, because most of them are not. Now, I will divide the racist off and say, you know, there are certain code things that we all know what they are. You know, it's not the same around here anymore. People, I think I may be quoting a certain Nigel Farage here. I don't hear anyone speaking English on the train anymore. All of those kinds of things. And what I'd urge you to do is don't wrangle on the street, on social media, with the racists. Because I don't know how to talk anyone into not being racist. I don't think you can. And one of the things that we need to do is make this debate much more sane and sensible. So really what we have to do is divide the racists off from the rest. They're there, they exist, and you might be able to see I'm wearing a Make Votes Matter badge here, talking about electoral reform. I would say that one of the things that caused the 2016 result was that people hadn't been represented, hadn't been listened to, and I think even racists should be represented in Parliament, much as I hate it. But what we have to do, and we have to demand this from all of our mainstream political figures, is to say they're there, but we split them off from the rest. And we say, yes, they're there, but we're not going to wrangle with them, we're not going to argue with it, and we're very much not going to jump onto the other side and try and take the people back by out-racing the racists, as happened far, far too often, I'm afraid, with some of our largest political parties with UKIP. So let's say we know they're there. Some people we can't change. We acknowledge their democratic rights, but we're going to put a wall down and say that's beyond the pale. But anyone who's been deluded into thinking that immigrants cause low wages, immigrants cause crowded schools and hospitals, immigrants cause the housing shortage, we need to talk them through why that's not true, slowly and calmly. Because what's behind this? I think politics is now splitting into two sides. And I think there was a great cartoon in Private Eye a few weeks ago now that was a sort of, classic middle-class couple leaning on the mantelpiece looking at a line of cards saying, oh yes dear, it's another invite to another new centrist party. But we are dividing, and I think naturally we can ensure that the majority are on the side of people like us who are saying there are enough resources in the world for everybody to have a decent life. There are enough resources in Britain to ensure that every worker is paid a real living wage, not George Osborne's fake living wage. And if you ask where the money that comes from, well, it comes from multinational companies that aren't paying their taxes now and that aren't paying their workers' property and who have enormous profits. And crowded schools and hospitals, we make those multinational companies pay their taxes. We stop the hideous waste and disaster of privatisation. And there are plenty of resources for all the hospitals and schools that we need. And housing. And in some ways, housing's the most difficult one. Because it seems kind of intuitively obvious that, oh, there's not enough houses and more people coming in, so that must be the problem. Except, first of all, there are more bedrooms per person in Britain now than there have ever been before. So this isn't the whole answer, but one of the questions to ask is, housing shortage? What housing shortage? Partly this is a measure of inequality. There's quite a lot of households of 2 people living in a 6-bedroom house and households of 6 people living in a 2-bedroom house. And there's also the fact that we have relied on the market to supply housing for decades, while we've sold off, privatised council housing under right to buy. And the problem is the market is a failure in providing housing. The problem isn't the immigrants, many of whom, of course, have come in and built lots of the houses that we have managed to build. So we need to, I might have done that very slowly and calmly, but when you're on the street stall or when you're on social media, calmly try and talk people through those conversations, the non-racists, and crucially, say to them that you are absolutely right to be thoroughly concerned, thoroughly angry about the state of Britain today. Lord Ashcroft did a really good poll very soon after the 16 vote, which showed that actually immigration was not the biggest issue by far. Take back control was. Mm-hmm. And immigration, as interestingly, the polls all show, slid down people's concerns. People are already starting to recognise this. As we've had the kind of debate that we should have had we had a proper referendum campaign back in 16, not essentially a 6-week Tory leadership contest, which is what most of the debate was about. People are starting to get this, and we can all, last time the Remain campaign, the official Remain campaign, was an absolute unmitigated disaster. And what we need this time, and what all of you here today are so important about, is we need a grassroots campaign for the people's vote, and we need a grassroots campaign to win the people's vote. And what we need to do is make sure that that is basically nice. The other side is vicious, nasty, and racist. We need to be really nice. And as Julie said, there's lots of things we can do to reach out in our own communities, to build links across communities. Some of the people who might say they're concerned about immigration and they come along to a thing to talk about, the need to build new council housing. Well, let's see if we can get that catered to by, a local Syrian refugee group that started up doing some cooking. I know quite a few of those. In Sheffield, we've got a great group of young women from a Somali background who've just started a cake business. Let's just reach out to people. Let's be nice to people, and really let's acknowledge that they are hugely right. When they kicked out in 16 and said, we're not happy, we're not going to take it anymore, how things are, they were right. But let's make sure we direct their concern not at the immigrants, but at the multinational companies, the rich individuals not paying their taxes, the whole way things have been structured for the benefit of the 1%, not for all of us. And they are all in all of us, and we need to embrace them, not yell at them. Please don't yell at them.
Thank you very much, Natalie. And now on to Emmy for the final speech.
Right, well, thank you for both of you having made so many important points. As a psychologist and a psychotherapist, I have been observing what's been going on in the country around the referendum and since then. And although immigration may not have been the only point, it was a very important one. And this is generally recognized as the advertisement that actually changed things around significantly. And from a psychological perspective, that was a very clever bit of marketing and advertising. Because as you can see, we see these hordes of people streaming into Britain as a huge, great threat. And underneath here, it is suggested that they are coming in through our membership of the EU, which was a lie. It's simply not true. And they also said Turkey was going to join and many dangerous people would come into the UK as a result. And people got really, really scared. They were already on the back foot. They were already living in a country that has been going downhill rather than uphill, and where many regions have become deprived. And in those deprived regions, the people who were most psychologically fragile were actually targeted by psychographic methods, sending them images like this, making them feel panic against immigrants, taking things away from them and becoming a threat to them. And this phrase, breaking point, was also very clever, because of course that's what Brexit means. It is about breaking away from our continent. And the suggestion that we must break away because otherwise we will get flooded appeals to the British feeling that we're on an island and we must be able to protect ourselves. So I think this playing into people's insecurities and their fears has been absolutely what has stoked up this anti-immigrant feeling. Both of you have talked about Syrian refugees, and yes, that's what was happening at that time. But really, that was then perversely translated into people becoming paranoid about the EU citizens in this country. The EU citizens, migrants, well, I'm one of them, and it's not quite like that. When I moved to the UK in 1977, soon after the UK had joined the European Union, I did not think of myself as a migrant. I wasn't immigrating into the UK. I was what you call a mobile citizen. I was just moving. I was born in The Hague in the Netherlands. I had lived for 7 years in France, in different parts of France, and I came to London for 20 years, and then I moved to Sheffield for 21 years, and these were just all different moves. It wasn't about immigration, it was just about enjoying freedom of movement, where we had come together with a sense of friendship and fellowship. Thank you very much. And in good faith, we all believed that we could rely on that. And what happened in 2016 was a huge shock to all of us, because we were reduced from being equal and at home to being under threat and being seen as undesirable. And I can't begin to tell you what that feels like. I never thought I would be in that position. And when I applied to the Home Office for British citizenship, it was because I wanted to vote in the referendum. And they refused me it after 40 years in the UK, paying taxes, setting up businesses. And I appealed, and they turned me down again. And then I smelled a rat. I knew there was something not right going on behind the scenes, and I became quite determined to not let that happen on my watch. When I eventually did get British citizenship, I then felt a commitment both to the other EU citizens who are still in limbo to help them and support them, but also to my new fellow citizens, my British fellow citizens, who are in a very dire situation where they have been lied to, where they have been manipulated, and where they have been pushed into blaming, scapegoating people who have nothing to do with the problems of Britain. And what I believe we need to do is reclaim that fellowship and that friendship and work with the other EU 27 to recreate that bond and remind ourselves of the importance of not letting a handful of politicians poison the water that we're going to have to drink, but reclaim the discourse and put in there these positives. Not this idealized image of the freedom of movement and the wonderful Europe, but what Europe is really about. A coming together of nations to work out our problems together. And we don't run away from that. And we don't put our borders down. We join in, and with every problem that we have to deal with, like climate change, we can only deal with it by being on a common path. We cannot do it in isolation. And I think it is the people who have migrated, who have a lot to contribute to that debate, because we understand what it means to work with people of different cultures, to speak different languages, to adapt, to change, and to be flexible. And I think we know that immigration is the lifeblood of a country. It isn't a threat to a country. In very real terms, you know, there isn't that much immigration in the UK as people think. The 2011 census said there were only 13% of the British population, 13%, are actually first-generation immigrants. That is 7.5 million, and roughly half of that are EU citizens. Now, as you probably know, EU citizens actually make a net contribution to the British economy, because they come here after having been educated elsewhere. So Britain hasn't had to pay for us in any way. And we bring our skills and our abilities and we try to offer them to Britain. So actually 2.16 million benefit from EU citizens every year, because EU citizens are much less likely to claim benefits than British people are. And as I said, they make a net contribution, whereas British people don't actually make a net contribution. So, the threat of Brexit on immigration is huge. We cannot do without this influx of immigrants and indeed this outflow of Brits going abroad, because it's roughly in balance. Yes, there are more coming in than going out, but actually it sort of follows very nicely. It works out. You know the situation we've got. The NHS can't get to EU citizens nurses anymore. There are now 50,000 vacancies of nursing jobs and 10,000 of doctors. And many of them are leaving because they're fed up being treated disdainfully. We must change this. We cannot be seen by the rest of Europe as being a country that treats other people so appallingly. We really must do more to take over the immigration debate and do something much more constructive about it. I am very surprised that no EU citizens, when there are 3.6 million of us in this country, no EU citizens are involved in government. Why? Why don't we have representation? Why did we not get the vote for the referendum when this has revolutionized our lives? So that's what I would like to end on. Can we please make a huge effort to support the EU citizens already here and to work internationally to reaffirm the idea that Britain is interested in working collegially with our cousins on the continent, and that we will treat each other equally and fairly, and that we reaffirm those good British values that are being lost of fair play, of kindness, and of diplomacy internationally. They have been lost. We want them back. We want to take back control of the values in Britain. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you very much to all of our speakers. I think we can all agree that was fantastic. We've got about 10 minutes now for quick questions. There is no roving mic, so speak up, and if anybody can't hear, give me a wave and I will shout the question out. Should we start at the front?
I have a question. I want to say, just listening to Emmy, actually I'm going to feel very emotional and very angry because I feel that actually nobody cares about people like me who are genuine European Union citizens. I was born in France, I came here, I'm married to a Bulgarian, and Brexit is going to rip our lives up. Because I can't move to France because I'm married to a Bulgarian who doesn't want to learn French at the age of 45. And I'm faced with losing the money and the life that I've saved up in Britain. If I move abroad, I will have to start again from the beginning. I will have to go back into education if I want to get a job in France. It will be very difficult for me. I spent 26 years here contributing to the country. As Emmy said, I was educated in France where I got a better education than I would have got here. And I'm contributing to this country. And I just feel ripped up. And I actually feel that most British people, whether they're Remainers or Leavers, don't care and don't really even understand that kind of pain.
They don't know. They don't know. They do care.
Well, they are.
Thank you so much for that. I think Emmy is exactly right. The British citizens care very much, especially those in this room, but many of them don't know, and that's, I think, a good moment to plug the In Limbo project at the back, who do a fantastic job of this, and we will hear from later in the conference.
People ask me, are you going to be okay? And I say, well, I'm a British citizen. My husband has indefinite leave to remain, so he doesn't even have to worry about settled status. He could apply for British citizenship. And they think that's the end of the debate, everything is fine from then on, but it's really not.
Absolutely. Any other questions? Yeah, this lady in the Leeds for Europe t-shirt, which again is for sale, to do a quick plug.
What's that lady's name?
Advertising. Okay, I'm David. I've been here since, I think, 1988 or something, and I fully understand you, and I wish we could have a conversation about this later, because I'm also in the same boat. I'm not going to take British nationality. I've decided for myself, so if it comes to the worst, I'll just have to go, but I don't want to do that. But my point is a different one. I'm in a special situation. I live here, my husband, our house, everything is here, but I actually work in Germany. And I'm a teacher, I work at schools, so I work a lot with young people. And you probably know that we have a bit of a problem in Germany at the moment too. And what Emmy said about the psychological side interests me a lot. Because that same photo she showed us, I don't know if you know, was the same photo that was displayed in Hungary for the elections which Viktor Orban won overwhelmingly. The same manipulation and the same fears. And if you heard what's going on in the east of Germany at the moment, in Chemnitz, with people actually fighting in the streets, I mean, that is terrible, because as a German, obviously, you all know our history. But what my question is, or my point is, everything you've said is right, and it's been great to listen to that. But apart from the contribution, apart from the emotional side, there is something else there, and that's prevalent in Germany. There's this sense of people, this sort of rather vague sense of identity, that people are coming over to, we have a German word for it, Überfremdung. It's like foreign infiltration. They're sort of, taking over our identity, stealing our identity. And that is very, very difficult, because it's such a vague, deeply rooted psychological fear, not just the Syrians, it could be anybody, it could be the Roma, it could be, you name it. But this fear, I see now on the streets in Germany, you talk to people, and it's the same here. And I find that very, very difficult to address, and I don't know, maybe we're not even there yet, but it's something that's, because you mentioned working internationally, that is so very, very important to address this, because I think people know that migrants don't take all our jobs, as the Daily Mail tells us, and they know that people, you know, the housing, all these issues, the schools, deep down they know that's not the problem. But this feeling of, you know, their identity being stolen, they suddenly don't feel German anymore. It's almost like Enoch Powell, you know, they're strangers in their own country, if you know what I mean. That is a fear that's very deep-rooted and very psychological, and that is being manipulated by something like that. And that's so difficult, and how can we address this?
Thank you very much. So, do any of the panel want to answer that a bit, how we address that? I think it's a tricky question.
Well, I think we have to ask, why do people now feel so insecure? And I think one of the things we have to do is take the word security back from the right wing. They claim security comes from guns and, goodness help us, nuclear weapons. Security comes from being able to always put food on the table, keep a roof over your head, feeling like you have a place being respected in society. And that's something I think, you know, particularly in the North, broadly speaking, we know how that's been torn away over many, many decades. So again, I think we have to acknowledge that to say you are feeling really insecure, you are right to feel insecure, but it's not because people are cooking curry down the road or making falafels on the corner. It's because your society, Britain, is not providing you with decent jobs, is not providing you with secure homes. So what we've got to say is acknowledge the insecurity and say you're right to feel insecure. I feel insecure too. But let's see how we can restore security. Whereas, you know, dividing the world up is only going to make us more insecure. And, you know, one of the things we have to do is what I just said was quite long and complicated. We've got to find ways with stories behind them that simply says, and, you know, my best effort at this at the moment is there's enough resources in the world if we just share it out properly. But I need someone who, you know, works for an ad agency, is paid $1 squillion to sell some totally useless product, to turn that into something nicer and buzzier and all the rest of it. But I think we've got to acknowledge that the insecurity has a good cause. And, you know, this is what's changed, whereas our societies have, if you look through the history, absorbed large numbers of people coming from very different societies. And we also need to look at the history and acknowledge there has always been some degree of people reacting like this. But actually, let's celebrate the home culture and let's say, you know, we need to give you security and allow you to live a decent life, then you don't need to fear anybody else.
Yes, thank you, that's wonderful. Absolutely right on. But there are other reasons why people feel insecure. It is also, look at Trump, you know, and the whole climate change debate. It's also that we become more and more aware that the world, the planet, is under threat. And that what may happen is that Africa and the Middle East will massively have to move out of these areas if they can't live there anymore. So these are the very issues we need to work together with other countries to resolve before they happen and as they happen, because there are some real dangers ahead of us. And if we don't face them, if we just hide behind our own borders or build walls as Trump would have us do, then we make these things worse, not better, because that's the way to create warfare and murder and mayhem. The only way to resolve that is to face the issues, talk about them, and find solutions. And part of that solution has to be securing people in their own country, in their own cities, in their own villages, with their own resources being safeguarded. But that should go for everyone, not just for some groups, leaving others out. Thank you.
Just make a lot has already been said. We are all our rights are under attack right now, all over the world. I work on women's rights and gender equality. I do anti-racist work, and it's, if you are other, I do disability rights work. We had an amazing, an In Limbo Liverpool for Europe event about children's rights that are under attack. All our rights are under attack. And if you are other in any way, then you are being attacked by this global pushback, really, and that was well articulated. But we're reaping the rewards of Theresa May's hostile environment right now, aren't we? That's what we're doing. She laid the foundations for this. When politicians say things, and then the press take it and whip it up into a frenzy, which is what happened. You can see the end result, you can see where it's going, and it's very, very dangerous. And dangerous, true, not just for us here in the UK, but right across Europe. It's very, very dangerous. And so I think that people need to, we kind of have to gather forces even more and more. Can I just say how sad I feel? I feel really sad at your story, but I was at a 2-day summer university in Brussels on citizenship, and I was with an organisation called European Alternatives, and they told me about a project that they had done in Ireland with Polish migrants who were really feeling on the sharp end of racism in Ireland. And the project was Polish people giving blood. And it really upset me. I'm like, what does it take to be accepted? Why can't you just live in this country and have a normal, ordinary life like everybody else? And it's a bit like the Muslims in Manchester. When the attack happened, everybody has to kind of be like uber helpful, has to go out of their way all the time to make massive efforts to prove that you're good citizens. And whilst I like that and I support it all the time, I am really sad that the young Muslims of Oldham spend every bloody Saturday picking up dog shit in the park. And that's what they're having to do to prove that they're useful members of society. Sometimes you just want to have a day off and be ordinary and go and kick a ball around, don't you? And it's like we've pushed people into corners, yes, but they're not able to even have ordinary lives anymore because they have to do this kind of uber civic society response all the time. So yes, we can point that out, and I am pointing it out all the time, but I think we have to address that, this, and it is a global problem. We are not just facing this here in the UK, and for me that's another reason, I mentioned it in the main session, it's another reason why Brexit is so dangerous, because what we are facing here in terms of racism and xenophobia and othering has its equal, and it also has its historical antecedent as well, and we all know where that goes. So we have to be clear that the road upon which we are travelling is a very, very dangerous road.
Thank you very much. So I'm very sorry we can't take any more questions, partly because the session is up, and more importantly because my boss is on the next session. I'll be in great trouble if I'm overrunning by any more than we already are. Just a quick thank you very much, obviously, to Leeds for Europe for hosting this event, to our fantastic panel. And if you do have any more questions, the In Limbo team at the back would be, I'm sure, delighted to talk to you about citizenship and immigration issues. Thank you very much.
I just realised what it was.